The third video that I want to present on our research methods topic is going to be on the research questions, research objectives, hypothesis, and aim. What we need to do though is to look at why is the introduction important. The first and main reason is that it sets the tone for the entire research. What we want to do is capture the audience's attention and establish some context and relevance of the study. Is it only a local study? Is it international? What are we including and what aren't we including? The idea here is to guide the audience into what is your research problem. You've been working on this for many years and you clearly understand why there's a problem here, what the gaps are. You've looked at the literature, so you have a very good understanding of why you're doing the research, but the reader doesn't know that. So you need to tell your audience or let them know why you're actually doing this work to help them or to encourage them to read your work. And in doing this, we can give the reader the confidence in the need for your work. And if you set the tone and the right confidence in your reader, they're going to be happy to read further and look at what you've actually done, knowing they can trust your results. The first section of your introduction chapter is typically going to be some sort of background and context. So what is the foundational knowledge that you have on this topic? We're not going to go into pages and pages of details of this background because this isn't a literature review. What you want to do is simply synthesize any existing theories or debates and studies into a very succinct argument to show that you have an awareness of the topic, you understand the general background, and you know why that there is a gap here. We want to justify this research gap and get the reader and the audience to understand that the research you're doing is important. We also want to show that you're not the first person to think of this, and we want to show that there have been others that have been working on this, and that they have possibly had a recommendation from their study that we need to look at this gap, and that you're going to fill in either this gap or some other gap. Or maybe you just want to repeat some of the results that they've got because you've got some information to show that there might be a problem with the numbers they've got, or that you just want to replicate it, or there's some other reason for this. This section is important though, because without this section, you're not going to be able to convince your reader that this research is even needed in the first place. Typically, the next section in a introduction chapter or an introduction section is going to be work on the research questions. What we want to look at here, or what I typically tell my students to do, is to formulate as many questions as they can and to typically brainstorm on a piece of paper to the side of your main document and come up with any sort of question that you can. And these can be from short questions to long questions, simple or quite advanced. By the time you get to actually formulating these questions properly and putting them into your final document, you are going to have a shorter list than this brainstorm. But what this list is going to give you is it's going to give you a clear list with a specific focused research inquiry direction on where your work is going to go. It's going to highlight the alignment with your study's objectives, which we'll come to later, and it's going to show that you had some sort of curiosity or interest in the topic, and hopefully you're going to share this interest, or it's going to evoke that same interest with your audience or your readers. These questions often use simple, precise language so that we can be very clear in what we are doing, and they're going to serve as a roadmap for the entire research. What you're going to notice here is that we are going to start off with research questions. We are going to move on to objectives. We're going to move on to aims. We're going to move on to a hypothesis. What can happen is that we are going to potentially become a little bit repetitive in what we are saying in our text. So depending on the nature of your study and depending on the templates that you are provided either by your university or your research group or the journal that you're submitting to, not all of research questions, objectives, aims, hypothesis may be included in the final written document. As I've already mentioned, I encourage research questions to become a brainstorming exercise to put as many ideas down on paper as possible. And those thousands or hundreds of questions will not make it into your final document, but the brainstorming exercise in itself is very useful. I find this particularly true if you're working in a group setting where you want to have your questions done independently from the questions of your lab partner or your research collaborators. And then when you bring them together after that brainstorming session, you can see if you're both on the same page or that you're all on the same page. And these research questions can then get reworked into shorter questions, more complex questions, and you can work from there. In terms of what you would look for in research questions, there are different types of questions that you can ask. Some of these questions are straight descriptive questions. Others are going to compare what is this versus that. We might want to correlate, explain, explore, or evaluate. So each of these types of questions you might want to look at individually. So in your brainstorming, you might want to start with what are all my descriptive questions and brainstorm all of those down and move from one to the other. But if this is a brainstorming exercise, you might want a little bit more freedom and not the structure of each of these types of questions. Typical examples, and like I say, there's no such thing as a silly question that we can ask here, but why do we need to use something? How long will it take to biodegrade? How long will it take to do something else? Can mass production be achieved? So in engineering, can our lab experiments actually be upgraded? So these questions are fairly short and simple. Again, whether they are good or bad, that's not going to be judged now. But the second set of questions, we can start to get a little bit longer. So what are the benefits of steel equipment as opposed to glass? Or what is the best way to design a metal steam distillation system? What is the distillation time for optimum yield? Again, I'm not going to comment too much on these examples here. I'll let you pause and decide whether these are good examples, bad examples, or how you would change them. Typically, the next section in an introduction is going to be the aim. The aim is going to describe the main goal of your research. It's a broad statement of the main goal of the research, and it's typically a single sentence for most studies. But if the study is going to get a little bit longer, it might become a short paragraph. Please note, a short paragraph or a few single sentences to list the different aims that might be undertaken in something like a PhD. After the aim, we might have the objectives, and these objectives are going to specify some measurable goal of the research. So what they are doing is clarifying the expected outcomes of the research and guiding us into a more defined setup or structure, which we can follow when we get to the method, in a way that we can show how we have answered some of the research questions that we have done before. Like we said, it's a clear roadmap, that fourth point there, on what we're going to be doing, but it's also providing a foundation or a structure for the subsequent analysis that we are going to be looking at. And again, to repeat myself, please pause. Here are some examples that may or may not be good. You can decide on what you think about these objectives, what you would add, or how you would change them. What exactly is the difference between an aim versus an objective? Aims are going to typically look at what will be achieved versus the objective asks, how will this be achieved? How are we going to find out what we are going to be doing? An aim is broad because it's typically a single aim in an entire study, whereas an objective is going to be more specific. Generally, we have one aim, whereas we might have 3 or 4 objectives within one aim. The aim is often a long-term outcome that is going to cover the entire study of interest, whereas an objective is often a shorter-term goal because there are 3 or 4 goals that are going to be met within one specific aim. We also need to clarify here, what is the difference between a research question versus an objective? In my mind on this one, a research question, as I've said many times already, is a brainstorming exercise and not necessarily a structured list. An objective is a definite structured list, and there's often 3 or 4 objectives per aim, maybe sometimes more. Research questions are going to be a lot longer. The research questions, again, this is my interpretation of this, is often a simple question to a more complex problem. So simple that we can have even a 3 or 4 word question, whereas an objective is often at the level of the research being undertaken. So what I mean by this is, if this is a PhD degree, your objective is going to be fairly complex because it's going to be a novel idea on the level of what is now 4 years undergrad, 5, 6 year. It's the 7th year of your university career, so it's not going to be something that you would write as a first year student. If you're working on something more simple, so let's say a 3-month or a 3-week project, the objective is often going to be more manageable or understandable by someone who's going to be reading your work, whereas the research questions could be at any level. The research questions, again, are a brainstorming exercise. The third point in this list is that the research question is a brainstorming exercise. I've said that already. So there are many, many questions, whereas the objectives, we are going to group some of these questions together into one objective so that they can cover several things at one time. The research questions are starting out as a curiosity, which becomes a question, whereas the objective is a statement on how we are going to complete the work. The hypothesis presents a testable prediction. What this is a structured approach to our investigation, and it's going to help us define our method as well. What it does is that it establishes an expected relationship between several variables. It also guides the experimentation or the analytical phase. This also helps convey the specific expectations for the data outcomes. In simple projects, the hypothesis can be fairly easy to define, and it will be a 1 or 2 line type sentence. In a more complicated MSc or PhD, the hypothesis is not as easy to define. It also might mean that several hypotheses might need to be presented. When talking about a hypothesis, we also need to define an independent variable and a dependent variable. The independent variable is something the researcher changes or controls. The thing that we change or control can also be seen as the thing that we are going to have on our x-axis, versus the dependent variable is something that we observe or measure, and the thing that is going to come onto our y-axis. Some simple examples of hypothesis are presented here. Again, I'm not going to indicate whether these are good or bad. We're also going to get different types of hypothesis, from simple, complex, null hypotheses, alternative, logical, statistical, or empirical hypotheses rather. I will ask you to pause on the slide to read up what the differences are here. And in the next slide, I will also give you some examples of each. Please again pause. The purpose of this presentation is not to go into in-depth details about hypotheses, but if you want to, please have a look, as I say, and pause. Two important types of hypotheses are the null hypothesis and the alternative hypotheses. We also have statistical tests which we can perform, which we have down on the left-hand column of this table. Let's just enlarge it quickly. So if you know you are going to have some type of statistical test, as per the left-hand side, you can have a look and see what is the null hypothesis that might be required, or the alternative, the HA hypothesis, that you might be proposing. In the introduction section of any piece of research, we might need to also state what the significance of this work is and any potential contributions that might be made. So this might come towards the end of your introduction, or it might come earlier on before your aims, objectives, research questions, when we are setting up the background to the study, but please don't forget to include it as it is needed. So things that might be included here are, what is the relevance or the real world implication of the things that we are proposing to study? How is this going to add value to the world, and how is this going to contribute to what we already know? What are the broader impacts on academia or industrial research for what we have been doing? Can you motivate to the audience why we are doing this? What is the importance of this, and how are we going to be contributing to the greater knowledge to society? Further to this, we're also trying to understand, is this simply an industrial project, an academic project, or are there contributions that we can make to society at large? In a similar way, we want to understand what is the scope of the project and what are the limitations. We might want to set out the boundaries and what exactly are we including in the study. Again, this might come after the aims and objectives, but it probably might sit better in the background of the work. Sometimes these scope and limitation statements are also better suited in the methods section if you are going to be telling people why or what you have included, why you've included it, and more particularly, why have you excluded certain portions of a study. These exclusions might simply be because of a lack of data, a lack of funding, or various other reasons. But don't be afraid to explain why you have excluded certain areas. What we want to do here is acknowledge that there might be potential challenges or constraints to our study, and that we don't want to simply avoid these, and the reader might look at us and say, but you forgot this. We are going to be upfront about what we are including and set realistic expectations for our readers. It's also going to help guide future researchers on the study, both in terms of the applicability of the study, but also in terms of what you've left out and what they can potentially fill in the gaps in other studies. In our introduction chapter, we typically don't talk about the methods per se, but some studies, and depending on the nature of your work, you might want to just quickly and briefly introduce the research design and any sort of methods that you are going to be using and what approach you are taking. Please do so succinctly, so be very brief about this. Don't go into heavy details. We'll come to that in a separate section later as well. But why are you selecting this approach? Can you give a brief overview of the methods that you are going to be using? Typically, this is going to set the stage for any detailed method section that we are going to have later on. But what it's doing here is that it's allowing the reader or the audience to understand which approach we are going to be taking at the beginning or the first chapter of our work. If you want more information on specific areas of this, please look at the links that I've presented here, or just Google a few of the words where you can get a little bit more in-depth information on a specific topic.